The only word to describe it is war. A war that has been waged on American soil for more than 40 years. The longest chemical war in history. And this is the enemy, the countless billions of agricultural pests that feed on America's food supply. In the past quarter century alone, farmers have dumped over 5 billion pounds of insecticide onto their crops. More than 11 billion pounds of herbicide into the soil. Almost 2 billion pounds of fungicides in an escalating war to ensure good harvests.
Yo sí cobro, chavalos. Ya bonche. A ver, ¿cuál quieren que les cante, pues?
Like any war, civilians caught in the middle are the first casualties.
I was a farm worker. Working on the soil, as I was turning it over, I started with bleeding fingers, skin rashes, the dizziness. My mother was a farm worker. She just was told it would go away, all her skin rashes. She started turning yellow and she died of cancer. It was diagnosed too late.
There is no longer any scientific question that agricultural poisons pose health risks to farm workers. What we don't know are the long-term chronic effects of pesticide exposure on the general population, and in particular, on children. These children attend the Browning Road Elementary School in McFarland, California, in the heart of the fertile San Joaquin Valley. Next door, this typical suburban development. Marta Salinas used to live here. It was built especially for farm workers.
For farm workers, low income and opportunity of the American dream.
What's it turned into?
A nightmare, a death trap. Wherever you go, your life is a time bomb.
This development was built near what had once been a pesticide dump. It is surrounded by cotton fields regularly sprayed by airplane. The drinking water has a long history of contamination by pesticide residues.
We're being exposed right directly over and over and over again.
It's a sort of a worst-case scenario for pesticides, isn't it?
Yes. And we are the perfect example for America to see.
What Marta saw happening was a neighborhood health epidemic.
2 years after she moved in the house, she started with brain lesions and seizures. She's had 2 surgeries. Then the next door.
Everywhere she turned,
Lori.
Marta saw neighbors and their children suffering from illness and deformity.
Then we've got another neighbor here where the little girl had kidney bladder problems, had urine tract open a couple of times, premature gray hair, the chronic diarrheas. Then we have this neighbor with the chronic diarrhea, the skin rashes, the hair loss, fevers. She's had surgery a couple of times.
Is there anyone on this street who hasn't had a problem?
No, everybody's been sick in this neighborhood.
One of Marta's daughters started losing her hair. Another had chronic skin rashes. The family moved out 2 years ago, and the symptoms disappeared. No one, it seemed to Marta, was paying attention, so she returns regularly to her old neighborhood to document the trail of disease in McFarland.
The red is for the cancers, the purple is for the tumors, the blue is the birth defects, the miscarriages is for the black, and it's just common sense that we have to think that if us in this neighborhood, any farm worker is dying, being exposed directly, what makes you think, or anybody out there think, that it's not gonna happen to them? They're eating this food, this contaminated food, in slow dosage.
Marta Salinas' community came to be known as the McFarland Childhood Cancer Cluster. 5 years ago, one study suggested pesticide exposure was probably a factor. But right now, there is no local, state, or federal agency even studying the question. So, Were pesticides the cause of all that disease among the children of McFarland? We really don't know. What we do know is that pesticide exposure is not just an issue for farm workers and their children, because there are minute traces of pesticides in the food we all eat every day. Some of it is what's called systemic, which means you can't wash it off. It's part of our produce. Does this exposure to agricultural chemicals threaten our health? And what about the most vulnerable among us, our children? Those are the questions we set out to explore in this broadcast, questions that concern all of us, but especially parents.
You got the good arm, son.
Farmer Paul Buxman never thought much about agricultural chemicals until his son Wyeth was diagnosed with leukemia over 10 years ago. Today, he worries about pesticides. A recent National Cancer Institute study found that if you live on a farm, you have a far greater chance of getting some forms of cancer.
I didn't want to just jump to the conclusion, oh yes, farm chemicals is what it is. Because after all, that was what was helping me produce. But I do remember kind of coming to this conclusion. What if I don't stop using a lot of this material, and I'll go ahead and tell Wyeth, we don't know for sure, I'm going to continue to use this stuff. What if 7, 10 years from now, and Wyeth is back in the hospital, and they find a direct link? What am I going to tell him? That the peaches were more important? That I was willing to take a risk? Even when I took over the home place, Dad didn't know what those chemicals were. I made a list when I came and took over the home place and said, Dad, what are these? I don't know, you'll have to call the guy up. I'm not sure what they're used for, but they told me it's for something. Some of them were definitely Category 1 heavy-hitting pesticides. They would kill basically anything in the field, including you if you were out there. And in some ways, we've kind of gone from farms to pharmacies. You know, it's like a dispensary. We're kind of dispensaries out here. The unhealthier the farm, the more we need their medicine. And how well it works out that the man recommending what you need, the doctor, in this case, is the man selling you the medicine. This is this incredible conflict of interest that we've lived with here for 30 years.
30 years ago, the public thought little about the health effects of pesticides. They were man's miracle drugs, ridding the farmer of pests and neighborhoods of mosquitoes. They were good for fruits and good for steers. In fact, everyone seemed to agree, DDT is good for me. Everyone, that is, but a respected biologist named Rachel Carson. She began to notice wildlife disappearing. And in her book, Silent Spring, Carson was the first to raise questions about the long-term effects of agricultural poisons on humans.
We have to remember that children born today are exposed to these chemicals from birth, perhaps even before birth. Now, what is going to happen to them in adult life as a result of that exposure? We simply don't know.
Back then, pesticides were registered by the Department of Agriculture based on their ability to kill pests, not on their potential health effects, as Agricultural Secretary Orville Freeman readily admitted to CBS News reporter Jay McMullen.
During the past years, do you think that the public was sufficiently appraised of the potential hazards of pesticides?
The answer I could say very quickly is no.
And yet the official government position on pesticides was nothing but reassuring.
There's no evidence that the small doses of pesticides that we do get are causing any harm. The only effect that can be measured objectively is the storage of one of them, DDT, in the tissues of most people. This storage has not caused any injury that we can detect.